"944 years ago, some local Saxons might have come to this very spot, the top of Beachy Head, and looked out there across the English Channel. And if they'd have been standing up here on the 28th of September, they'd have seen a mighty invasion fleet out there. Ships crammed with thousands of warriors and horses, and among them, Duke William of Normandy, a man who within weeks would lead that army into battle at Hastings and whose destiny it was to become King of England. 1066, the most famous date in British history. What actually happened between the Norman fleet appearing out there and the Battle of Hastings, fought 16 miles that way? Well, that's what I'll be finding out today as I walk in the footsteps of the Normans. In this series, I'll be looking at very specific moments of the Norman story, trying to find out what the great British landscape can tell us about what we know for sure and what's just speculation. And the first story I'll be looking at was played out along this stretch of the south coast. Today, I'll be armed with the most famous piece of Norman evidence of all, the Bayeux Tapestry. A detailed illustration of events that took place along my walk. It stands alongside a handful of Saxon and Norman chronicles as valuable accounts from soon after the invasion, and they mean we can be fairly certain of a few key events. William and his Norman army hit the English coastline on the 28th of September, but it was mid-October before they squared up against the might of King Harold and the Saxons. My walk is going to lead me to the battlefield itself. But why did the armies clash here, and why not earlier? On my way to battle, I want to explore the town of Hastings and understand the role of the Saxon manors that once littered the local countryside. But before that, there's the coastline itself, because first of all, the Normans needed somewhere to land. The Bayeux Tapestry gives a beautiful depiction of what William's fleet must have looked like. Absolutely vast numbers of men and horses. And you can see even the decoration on the prow of the ships here. That also leaves us in no doubt as to where William actually landed on the coast. They said they arrived in Pevensey. And that's why I've come here to Pevensey Castle to begin my journey. But the first thing you notice about this ancient coastal defensive site is that it lies a good mile from the coast. The Romans had established a fort at Pevensey some 8 centuries before the Norman invasion. At that time, the castle stood on a finger of firm ground, a projection between the marshy inlet of Pevensey Bay and the long beach that once ran beneath the castle walls. But what role did this spot play for Duke William? Hi, David. I've arranged to meet David Carpenter, Professor of Medieval History, and someone who can answer a very obvious question.
Well, why Pevensey? I mean, you could argue that it was just an accident, you know, the wind blowing there, but I'm absolutely sure that wasn't it. I think it was very, very carefully calculated. And Pevensey's got 2 great advantages. The first is that this Roman fort, but also if you look out there and look at all the marshland round, it's very difficult to approach, and so it's completely safe. But I don't think that was the main reason. I think it's not so much Pevensey as Pevensey Bay. Because what you've got here is that great mass of shingle beach where you can bring large numbers of ships up. You probably had well over 1,000 ships. So you can't use a port. You've got to, like 1944, D-Day, you've got to run them up onto the beach. And that's just what the Bayeux Tapestry shows, because it shows all the boats being drawn up onto the beach and then the horses being unloaded. And that's what you could do at Pevensey.
What about the Bayeux Tapestry? Because it's such an important source, and yet Historians like you are sort of questioning some of its veracity.
There's a terrific debate about it. Everyone would agree that it's early, that it's probably very soon after 1066. But beyond that, there's a great debate, because on the one hand, there's the view that it's simply the Norman story, Norman triumphalism. On the other hand, there's the view that it's got an English subtext, and that because it was certainly woven in England. And there's the idea that the English weavers, many of them women perhaps, were trying to sort of make the English case. They were trying to make Harold a great heroic figure. I mean, I personally think that's a load of nonsense.
Okay.
And that the whole of the tapestry can be explained in terms of Norman triumphalism. So, I mean, why is Harold like that? It's just that it makes the victory all the greater. And, yeah, you do have to take some of it with care, because it's very much giving the Norman version. I mean, you've got a classic example of it there, which is Harold's oath. Here he is taking this oath to Duke William, and it's basically the oath. I mean, the tapestry begins with the whole story of Edward the Confessor sending Harold to Normandy in order to take this oath to give the throne to William. Now, that's in all the Norman sources. It's not in any of the English sources at all. It's not in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is the main English source about events. And so, you know, historians have debated, did this happen or not?
I've always been fascinated by the relationship William had with England in this. I mean, he's not going to an unknown foreign land when he arrives here, is he?
The extraordinary thing about that is, which is very, very little commented on, is that Fécamp Abbey, the great ducal abbey in Normandy, where the Dukes of Normandy are buried, it has properties here, because Edward the Confessor had given Fécamp Winchelsea and Rye further up the coast. Now, that must mean there was great connections all the time, nexus between Fécamp and this area, people going backwards and forwards, bailiffs, money going backwards and forward. So the conqueror could have been, through Fécamp, very genned up. And not merely could, he was, because he spent the Easter of 1066 at Fécamp. And I'm absolutely sure that that's where he found out about the area.
So, right, he's got a sort of protected site here. He's surrounded by marshy land.
Yeah.
He's secured the beachhead, which is what you've got to do. What does he do next?
Well, that's another extraordinary thing, because having got to Pevensey, he leaves it immediately. I think if you look out here, look at all the marshland around, you can see why. Because Pevensey is a jolly good place to land and a jolly bad place to stay. Just basically bog all around Pevensey. And the tapestry shows this, because the tapestry shows the knights going immediately from Pevensey. And what's the actual title there? They're going to seize food. So that's one thing, but they're also going to ravage.
So, just like William and his men, I'm moving swiftly on from the isolation of Pevensey and heading east to start my walk. 10 miles along the coast is one of the ancient ports of southeast England, a commanding settlement with a history going back 2,000 years. In 1066, William chose to settle at the well-connected Saxon burh or town called Hastings. Hastings is the town that's given its name to the battle that marked one of the most important turning points in British history. That's slightly strange, because in fact the battle took place a few miles inland. But Hastings does have an important part to play in this story, because it may have been the site of William the Conqueror's first castle in England. But all that's left of that now is that mound over there. Hastings was to be the Normans' headquarters in the run-up to battle. And looking at the tapestry again, we can see a wooden fort being erected atop a patch of high ground. But the tapestry isn't precise about where this fort might have been. Today, we can only look for clues. This is the motte of Hastings Castle, a man-made defensive earth mound that the Normans like to put at the heart of all their castles and fortifications. Now, in the 1960s, it was partially excavated, and what the archaeologists discovered really surprised them, because the Normans have a great reputation as castle builders, but this motte is a bit unstable and far too sandy. It suggests that it was thrown together in quite a hurry. So it's likely, if not certain, that this humble mound was the focal point of events in early October 1066. The cliff overlooking Hastings would seem a sensible spot for William to first make his mark on English soil. And from here he unleashed a 2-week reign of terror, designed to feed his troops, devastate the area, and incite his Saxon foe into battle. So if we assume that William's army did come here to Hastings, how did he get to the battlefield, which is actually some way inland. Well, armies need good, firm ground, and there's a ridge that runs right along here towards the battlefield itself, so we can assume he went up there. However, nowadays that's all main roads, so they don't make for very interesting walking. So what I'm going to do is go slightly along the coast and then in here to find out what this landscape can tell us about these few days that had such a vast impact on English history. To get from Hastings to the battlefield, I'll walk west along the coast to find out why this town worked so well as William's headquarters. Turning inland, the extent to which this coastline has changed becomes clear as I traverse the one-time tidal inlet known as Combe Haven. All around here were the Saxon manors and settlements of the rolling Sussex countryside. In particular, I'll pass through Crowhurst, King Harold's own manor, deliberately targeted for destruction by the Normans. From here, I'll head towards the battlefield, joining the route taken by the Normans out of Hastings and through the spot where the opposing armies would have first spied each other. The final stretch of my walk follows events in the run-up to battle, leading me right onto the battlefield at Senlac Hill, beneath the great abbey and the town that marked the place where a new era of history was forced upon our island nation. But back at Hastings, I already know that the ancient Saxon port has been long since eradicated, lost to the sea in the area around the Hastings pier. But is it possible to imagine how Hastings might have worked for William? A question I put to the Sussex County archaeologist.
Good to meet you.
Thanks for talking to us.
Pleasure. The coastline here is completely different now, mainly because of erosion along this part of the coast. Effectively, because of the geology, you've got hard rock pieces coming out here at White Rock, at West Hill, where the castle is, and at East Hill. And between them, you've got a series of valleys. And the valleys have silted up and the headlands have eroded. So 1,000 years ago, the coastline would have been more complex than it is now.
So why choose this stretch of the south coast of England to invade?
Well, between the White Cliffs of Dover to the east and the White Cliffs at Beachy Head to the west, you've got two big areas of marshland, Pevensey Levels and the Romney Marsh, and in between those you've really got one significant area of high ground where the High Weald comes to the coast.
And is Hastings better placed then for a move inland towards the heart of Saxon England?
The High Weald is particularly good for its iron content, and the iron industry was established in the prehistoric period, but it was during the Roman period that it became very, very significant. And the Romans used a lot of the slag to create superb roads. You know, they've got metalling, slag metalling this thick, and they would have produced roads which would have lasted right through the Saxon period into the 11th century. So you've got this fantastic infrastructure of Roman roads, many of which come down to the coast around this sort of Hastings Peninsula.
So it's amazing. So we talk about William's great generalship, but so much of it actually just comes down to logistics, communications, and geography. The changing face of this coastline is absolutely key to understanding why the Normans behaved as they did. What we now see as this would once have looked more like this. And when you remember the ridge of high ground and the Roman road stretching north, Hastings starts to look like a very logical place from which to organise an operation. Today this feels like such a straight, stable piece of seafront, but in fact that's only been achieved at the expense of thousands of hours of busy human activity, building these groins out here and desperately trying to hold the beach in place and stop the channel eroding the coast as it would have done for millennia. Just west of Hastings' high ridge, this is Bulverhythe. The name is Saxon, meaning harbour of the borough. Over 1,000 years ago, it was a narrow gateway to an inlet that filled the boggy marsh now known as Combe Haven. The question is, what state would Combe Haven have been in 1066? This is very telling. There have been 2 weeks of fine, dry weather, but even at the moment, the ground here in Coomhaven is soaking wet, completely waterlogged. Speculation has run to the idea that the Norman fleet itself could have sailed as far inland as here. But, perhaps more reliably, archaeological reports suggest humans have been digging drainage channels here since the Roman age. By the time the Normans got here, mankind was already trying to assume control. So even after all the drainage that's gone on here, all the land reclamation, it's amazing just how waterlogged Coomhaven still is. And I've never been down here before, and it's absolutely fascinating because it allows you to say with certainty that no medieval army could have passed through this march. So there's Hastings over there on that high ground. William is protected on both sides by these marshy areas. But it does also mean that he has to stick to that high ground when he moves inland. And that's why I've come down here, because you get a great view of William's route from the sea inland towards the battlefield. For 2 weeks in October 1066, the area between Hastings and the battlefield bore the brunt of the Norman army's occupation. These were productive, fertile lands, and all around Coomhaven would have been Saxon settlements, ideally placed for feeding William's troops. Well, I've emerged from the marshes, and what greets me but the sight of a cricket square. That's very Sussex. I'm sure there's a vicar on a bicycle around here somewhere. But to quote from the Domesday Book, this same area was laid waste by the Normans. 20 years after the invasion, Domesday records that 2% of Sussex lands were still entirely unproductive, all of them lying in this area around Hastings. This is the rather picturesque village of Crowhurst. We know it's been here since the Saxon period. One of the reasons is because Hurst is a classic Saxon suffix meaning clearing in the woods. But so are some of these other villages around here because they've all got ham at the end, which is another Anglo-Saxon suffix. You've got Little Worsham Farm, Pebsham Wood. Up here you've got Monkham Wood. So this is an area that's absolutely dripping in Anglo-Saxon heritage. And it's not just any old village, this one, because this was actually part of the personal estates of King Harold. Even before he seized the throne in early 1066, Harold was the most powerful landowner in this part of England, and William knew that. The would-be conqueror made a beeline for the manor of Crowhurst, inciting Harold with a direct assault on his local people. Right here next to the church is this incredible yew tree, which is at least 1,000 years old and quite possibly much older than that. And yew trees were always great meeting points for communities. And so what Christians tended to do was simply co-opt those pre-existing spiritual places and just stick a Christian site next to it. So that seems to be what's happened here. Absolutely amazing to think that this yew tree was here when William landed on that shore. Whether William himself came here or not, we'll simply never know. But we can be sure that Harold certainly wasn't at home. He was engaged in Yorkshire, crushing the Viking invasion at Stamford Bridge, leaving Crowhurst to meet its fate. Romantics would have you believe that the tapestry displays this very moment, with the harrowing image of a fleeing woman being that of Harold's mistress, Edith Swanneck, who days later would have the job of identifying the king's mutilated body. This is a fantastic historical novel published in 1948 called The Golden Warrior. One of the most dramatic scenes is when William comes here to Crowhurst, and it says that Harold's reeve had buried his lord's treasure under the great yew in the churchyard, and he his men were taken, and not a soul would tell Duke William where the spoil was hidden. And then the reeve was hanged from the yew tree, and the rest barred within the hall and burnt. William and his captains watched the reeve die and hearkened to the cries of those burned. Some of the barons mocked, some of them yawned. The Duke kept silence, his face unchanged. Now that's pretty exciting stuff, although it has no basis in fact whatsoever. But that hasn't stopped people around here telling visitors that King Harold's reeve, his man of business, was actually hanged from a tree in this churchyard. And for me, that just shows that even nearly 1,000 years after the events of this bloody year, we're still mythologising it and still retelling the story in our own way. But by walking this land, you can go some way towards stripping away the myths and legends from the likely truth of events. As I head up the gentle slope of Telham Hill, I'm joining the route taken by the Normans as they left their camp and moved inland, attempting to grasp the upper hand as Harold completed his 250-mile journey from Yorkshire. Now, technically, I have left the footpath behind which runs along that fence, but I hope the farmer will forgive me. I'm looking for this absolutely classic view. The one view you don't get, though, is the one view I want, which is that way towards the battlefield, because the stockbroker belt's in the way. But I reckon if I get onto that road, try and peer through the hedge, I might get a better view. Now, I think this guy here has basically got the view that I want, so let's go down the hill a bit and try and cut in front of him. Also get away from his aggressive dogs. I think this might be just perfect. Wow! That's a fantastic view. There's the battlefield there, where the ruins of that abbey are now, and then as you go up the ridge you can see the windmill, which marks the site, it's said, where Harold and his army were gathering. So by the time William gets up here, he can actually see his enemy. He can almost smell them. They're so close now, they're like two juggernauts heading towards each other, two nations in arms that are bent on the destruction of the other. Chroniclers of the Norman era paint a picture of William giving a Shakespearean speech as his army eyed the opposition. The very pro-Norman William of Poitiers even has William offering Harold the chance of a noble solo combat to settle the issue of the English throne, saving the bloodshed of thousands. Harold apparently rejected the offer, saying, "Our advance continues. We march to victory." For modern visitors, the area around the battlefield now plays host to a sizable Sussex town. Well, after all that lovely tranquility, I've finally arrived at the bright lights of the town of Battle. But before I go and look at the battlefield itself, which is just there, I'm going to have a look at how the Saxons were doing at their camp over here. If the Vikings hadn't threatened in Yorkshire, Harold would have been ready and waiting in Sussex. The outcome of 1066 could have been very different. For good as William was, Harold too was a renowned commander. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle states that Harold mustered his troops at the Hoar Apple Tree, believed to have stood up here by the windmill on Caldbeck Hill. And that's where I'm meeting a town resident who's written about the local landscape and how it influenced events around the battle. What a fantastic view from up here.
It's gorgeous, isn't it?
Yeah. Very commanding position this. I mean, it's the first time I've been able to see a long way north. And what are the key features of that geography up there?
Well, basically trees. It's the vastness of the Andredsweald, the great Wealden forest, which covered most of Kent, Sussex and into Hampshire. It stretched north to south from here almost to the Thames, and so an impenetrable barrier really, and certainly not one that William would have relished marching through until he was certain of victory.
So how do we know that Harold chose this spot as a rendezvous?
Where we are now on Caldbeck Hill was the focal point of 300s, 100 being the local administrative unit. And there are several examples of that, some 14 at least, where apple trees were planted at those points. So really this was the first piece of open country that he could assemble troops on. And so we can be pretty sure that this is the site of the Hoar Apple Tree, of the rendezvous which the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us of.
So Harold's really sort of blocking William in here. He's trying to stop him from getting further inland and causing more damage.
That's right.
Harold acts with great speed, doesn't he? He comes down here from London. Why rush? Why not wait to gather more men, you know, garner all the resources that his kingdom had on offer to go and really crush this invader?
He enjoyed very much the element of surprising his enemies. He'd used it only a few weeks previously, most successfully up at Stamford Bridge. So
take the battle to the enemy. Don't wait for the enemy to come to you.
Well, thanks so much. So Harold was supremely confident, and William didn't want to let his troops get stuck in a British winter. Battle was inevitable. On the morning of the 14th of October, it was the Saxons who would have filed along what is now Battle High Street, a town that owes its very existence to the victory of the Normans. The Saxons headed south to this point to assume a defensive position along the top of Senlac Hill, which for me marks the end of my walk. You'd certainly be forgiven for thinking that all the fighting at the Battle of Hastings took place in this one little confined field, but that's not the case at all. It's spread a long way that way, inland, and down there to that boggy area. Up there, on that ridge, is where the English army were, rooted to the spot in a thick shield wall, beating the swords on the back of their shields, shouting, "Out, out, out." Well, down there in the valley, having made the march from the coast at Hastings, was the Norman army, archers, infantrymen, and cavalry. Accounts from the time tell us that the Battle of Hastings raged for an entire day, a remarkable duration for a set-piece medieval clash. The sides must have been fairly evenly matched, but we have little idea about how many would have fought here. Perhaps it was 5,000 per side, but it could just as easily have been 10,000 or more. There have never been any archaeological finds in this field that prove that the battle was definitely fought here. The acidic soil has done away with what the scavengers left behind. But there is one piece of evidence which is fairly conclusive. The ruins of this abbey, built by William to commemorate his victory and to do penance for the blood that was shed here and his savagery in the weeks leading up to the battle. And here at the centre of the abbey is where the high altar would have been, erected on the very spot on which King Harold was killed. Amongst the eulogising of the Norman chroniclers, the expressive licence of the Bayeux Tapestry, and a sorry lack of archaeology, the abbey stands as a rare monument in the landscape, a surviving marker for the events of the Norman invasion. Even though I've learned a huge amount about the 1066 campaign by walking the ground, there's still a huge amount that feels very obscure, like the shape of the coastline or the numbers of people involved. And I think that's because that virtually before the fighting had even stopped, people were retelling the stories and mythologising these events, and every generation since has been following suit. But one thing we can say for certain is that in 1066, in this area of the country, a decisive battle took place, one that saw Duke William of Normandy become William I, King of England, the conqueror, and it was the beginning of the Norman Age. Join me for my next walk on the Welsh borders, when I'll be finding out what the Normans did next. They'd won a battle, but could they consolidate their rule across a whole island? Welcome to the Welsh borders. The other side of that ridge is Wales, and I'm in England, but only just. And this is a textbook Motte Bailey Castle. It was the Normans who famously built motte and bailey castles, and this one here at Longtown is one of just dozens spread through this part of the country. What were the Normans trying to achieve here? How were they using these castles to impose their control across great swathes of the British landscape? And why are there so many of them in this part of the Welsh borders? Well, I'm going on a walk today that's going to take me past several of them, and I should get some answers. This really is a classic motte and bailey castle. I'm in the Bailey area down here now. That man-made earth mound is the motte, and there's a stone keep on top, which is about 150 years after the Norman conquest. But it seems very likely this would have been an important military position right the way through the Norman period. And it's one of just dozens in this area. Just take a look at this map. There's a motte here, a motte there, and also a motte there. But in the case of this particular castle, the extraordinary thing is there's another one about a 5-minute walk down the road. I've come to this packed corridor of medieval history to understand how the Normans consolidated their rule following their victory at Hastings. Throughout much of England, they inherited an efficient, well-organised state from the Saxons. Here, around the valley of the River Monnow, the situation was very different, and from the outset, it's clear that the Normans made quite an impact. Oh yeah, there it is. The unmistakable lump. Another Norman motte. I love the way this one's just in someone's back garden. This whole area in the shadow of the Black Mountains is crisscrossed with a complicated anarchic network of castles and other defensive fortifications. And they were presided over by a group of men known as the Norman barons. The story of these castles is the story of the barons. My first two motte and baileys lie on the western extremity of English lands. The Black Mountains make a superb natural boundary, so it's no surprise they still form part of the modern Anglo-Welsh border. Moving south, the border begins to follow the route of the River Monnow, and my walk explores the landscape and some of the many castle sites in and around the valley. But on my way to the start of the walk, there's one site which demands to be visited. This cluttered heap is actually the motte of a castle called Lewis Harold. Now, actually, it doesn't look like much, but it is a historical gem because this place has a claim to being the first Norman castle ever built in Britain. In fact, it's so old that it was actually built before the Norman invasion. Lewis Harold, with its back to the Welsh mountains, stands at the confluence of the Monnow and the Dore rivers. You only have to look at the landscape from above to appreciate the site's potential as a communications control centre. In 1050, the King of England, Edward the Confessor, sanctioned the building of this castle here. Now, it's often forgotten that Edward had spent much of his childhood, his formative years, in Normandy. He was almost more Norman than English. And even after he returned here to take the throne of England, he retained lots of Norman advisors, and they were responsible for the building of this castle. So this is a pre-Norman Norman castle. I find it quite extraordinary that a milestone in British military history like Lewis Harold today goes almost unnoticed. Another small blip on the Ordnance Survey map, a loosely demarcated area tended only by a band of friendly goats. Shortly after the Norman conquest, this castle was refortified by a man called William Fitz-Osborne, who was a close advisor and a relative of William the Conqueror. He was the first Norman to have a big impact on this part of the country. You can see the Monnow Valley there stretching directly from England towards Wales. So this is the route he and his followers must have taken. I always imagine it like tentacles of Norman influence spreading ever further inland. Fitz-Osborne kicked off an intense period of castle building. It formed the backbone of efforts to bring the turbulent Welsh borders under Norman control. And my walk today explores the purpose of these castles, set amid the stunning landscape of the Monnow Valley. From the Welsh side of the river, I'll be setting off from the imposing White Castle. There's already a popular route here called the Three Castles Walk, leading me east across farmland to meet the Monnow at Skenfrith Castle. I'll then head upstream, following the modern England-Wales border, across the most fertile land and through ancient woodland to reach the third castle. It sits overlooking the river at Grosmont, surrounded by church and village. To end my walk, I'll cross the river border to England, and in particular to Kent Church, seat of the Scudamore family. Here I'll drop in on 1,000 years of family history before ascending the giant Garway Hill, a famed border viewpoint, the ideal place to assess the landscape that the Normans worked to bring under control. And in 1067, all of this land on both sides of the Monnow was in the hands of William Fitzosborne, the Conqueror's great Earl of Hereford. Welcome to Wales. I've come a few miles south of Lewis Harold, and yet now I'm in Wales. But really, these modern borders aren't much help in 11th century terms. Back then, this area was neither totally English nor totally Welsh. Which goes some way to explaining the impressive nature of the start of my walk here at White Castle. I haven't actually been here since I did a rather geeky road trip with my dad when I was about 11 through the Welsh castles, and I'd forgot just how complete this one is. It's stunning. If Lewis Harold represents phase 1 of Norman castle building in this part of the country, this and others is phase 2. White Castle enjoys a spectacular outlook, set high, overlooking the low ground around Abergavenny. It's regularly touted as a Norman castle, yet, like so many medieval castles, most of what we see here today was added a good deal after the Normans. So to find out what was happening here shortly after the conquest, I've arranged to meet David Austin, Professor of Archaeology and an expert in medieval landscapes and settlements. And on a day like today, where better to discuss such matters than from the top of a castle.
What you get when you get up here is this absolutely incredible view.
Wow.
Amazing, isn't it? You're looking slam right across into Wales and these wonderful rolling hills in this direction and straight across to England over there.
Does the high number of castles around here basically mean this was sort of the Badlands, no man's land?
The way I like to think of it really is this is liminal country, this is frontier country. And it's best to think of this region as really made up a whole patchwork quilt of these small local power brokers operating within river valley systems and so on, who acknowledge some power structure above them. And I don't think they're bad lands, but it needs controlling. And the Normans have to invent a way of controlling it.
What do they invent?
Well, what they use is a concept I think which really comes out of the great period of Charlemagne. Creates this thing called the march. Now the march comes from a German word, an old German word, which means the boundary, the edge, the mark. And this is what Charlemagne did. He created these great marches around the edges of his empire. He used those as the buffer zones while he established this incredible Charlemanic Empire right at the core, which became, of course, the Holy Roman Empire.
And what happens on this march? You just send some of your toughest guys out and say, look, I don't care what you do, but just keep that border safe for me.
It's sort of like that. A march or contract is, if you can hold it, you can run it, and you can exploit it to your greatest extent if you want. And by the way, because you're on a boundary, if you want to go further, everything beyond you, you take, you hold, it's yours. They're given subrogalian powers. In other words, they're allowed to act as if they're kings in their own territories.
And so William Fitzosborne is sort of entrusted with this, like this buffer zone, but by William the King, is he?
Yes, he is. Well, William Fitzosborne was one of the dozen or so men in 1066. And I like to think of them as a band of brothers. They grew up together, they fought together, they knew to trust each other in battle.
But what do we know about Fitzosborne in this part of the country?
Well, we don't know a great deal about him, to be honest. We know he's given this great lordship, and we hear of him building castles. But as far as the legacy is concerned, of course, we're looking back through all this wonderful Marcher history, and he's the progenitor. He's the origin myth of the whole of the March. So we feel we know more about Fitzosborne than we actually do.
And this castle that's standing in here right now, where does this fit in, do you think?
Well, it's an absolutely classic example. It looks for all the world as this is a very, very early castle. You would expect it to be a Fitzosborne castle, most of the speculation in guidebooks and so on, but actually there isn't a shred of evidence. The first evidence for White Castle is in the 1160s. And the architecture, the layout, the morphology of it suggests that it might be earlier than that. But to be perfectly honest, you can't tell, because most of what you see here, in fact, is 13th century.
So we know Fitzosborne was here, effectively acting as king in his new Marcher earldom. But frustratingly, as I set off on the first leg of my route, the extent of his actions here are unclear, lost in a land where royal record-keeping did not apply. And by the middle of 1071, less than 5 years after the invasion, William Fitzosborne was dead. His son and heir, Roger, would prove to be a liability, breaking the bond of the band of brothers, rebelling against William the Conqueror and losing the great Fitzosborne earldom in the process. Never again would the Norman kings grant one individual so much land and power in one area. For my walk today, though, the demise of the Fitzosbornes was a turning point. The area of the three castles would now become one small barony. I've started the walk at the White Castle, which of the three castles is the furthest west. It's the one that juts provocatively into Welsh territory. The other two are alongside the River Monnow, heading back towards the English heartland. Now this, according to my trusty guidebook, is the old coaching road from London to Abergavenny and points west all the way out to Milford Haven. Like so much of the infrastructure of early modern Britain, this road seems to have been built on an earlier Roman road. And speaking of the Romans, there's an interesting contrast between them and the Normans. The Romans built forts along their roads at regular intervals, so there'd be a certain number of miles between each one. And people have often argued that the Normans would build castles about half a day's horse ride away, so a knight could ride to a castle and be back by nightfall at his own castle. But actually, as we've seen here in the borders, that's nonsense. Castles were built haphazardly to meet different threats at different times by all sorts of different barons. The Normans lacked a master plan, but by exploring the landscape, you get to assess how they went about colonising this area. It's surely no coincidence that they built two castles close to this major access route to South Wales. Well, those Romans really knew what they were doing, didn't they? This is a fantastic road here running right along the top of this ridge. There's a beautiful view from here of the Monnow River Valley. It comes up through there in a great curve and into the Black Mountains. And of course, it flows that way where Chepstow, the great seat of Norman power, the base of William Fitzosborne himself was. But from this high point, it's downhill for me, to the second of my three castles. Tucked quietly away in a natural surround of hills is the delightful village of Skenfrith. After the Eagle's Nest vantage point of White Castle, you couldn't imagine a more different setting. And like White Castle, the great stone walls here are from the early 13th century. But Skenfrith has no large motte, no ditch or moat, and it's surrounded by higher ground. In fact, this castle would have been a liability in terms of defence. Aha! One of the key reasons for the siting of this particular castle, the Monnow River. The truth of Skenfrith is that it didn't play any part in the early Norman settlement of the March. There's no evidence of a castle being here until around 1140, 70 years after Fitzosborne's death. King Stephen, the last of the true Norman kings, would have been on the throne, by which time the invaders had become the establishment, and Norman dominance had spread west, deep into Welsh territory. So although these ruins are post-Norman, the River Monnow was always an absolutely central strategic corridor for the Normans, particularly because it led downstream to Chepstow and Monmouth, the two great centres where the Norman lunge into South Wales was really being planned from. And all the way up the river, you see on this map a series of motte and bailey castles. There's one here, one up here at Grosmont, where I'll be going later, and right the way around to places like Ewes Harold and Longtown, which are all part of the Monnow River system. And the map also shows us one other fascinating thing about this particular area, a place called Newcastle, appropriate enough. It was an early Norman motte and bailey castle. And it does seem that that castle, high up there in the hills, could have been the focus of the early Norman efforts. But this place, Skenfrith, was developed later as the Normans moved from the phase of conquest to consolidation. Today, the Monnow seems like an irregular, shallow stream, but the castle here once had a wharf, proving that boats could pass from the Bristol Channel and up towards the Welsh hills. It also proves that by the end of the Norman period, transport and communications along the Monnow Valley were certainly important. What an absolutely beautiful bend in the river. England there on one side, Wales here on the other. Back then, this would have been a highway into the interior, carrying all sorts of traffic, soldiers coming in, but being followed by colonists, settlers, tradesmen, craftsmen, and administrators, all using this river to get right up into the hinterland. Nowadays, of course, the road sticks to the high ground, so this feels like a little forgotten corner of this part of Wales. In rugged areas like this, river valleys were always prime agricultural strips. But in the 11th century, farming here lacked the market towns and the economy of the Saxon heartlands. The barons cemented their own power by overseeing a process of civilization, encouraging new settlers from both England and Normandy. And as my walk climbs towards Grosmont, the landscape still shows signs of how the barons managed the activities of the population. Vast tracts of land became subject to forest law, a concept the Normans brought with them from the continent. Here, the barons were lawfully allowed to control access and administer their own swift justice. We think of forests as wooded areas, but forest law applied to up to half of the land in the area. It was an authoritarian regime, enabling the minority to dominate the majority. There's the fertile valley of the Monnow River there. There's a big hairpin bend just over there. You can see a castle. That's where the Normans chose to build one. And today the castle and the village that sprung up around it is called Grosmont, but it's spelt, much how the Normans would have pronounced it, Gros-Mont, meaning big hill. The third cornerstone of the three-castle walk is a fine example of the Normans' success here. There's the castle itself, with its D-shaped earthwork ditch, the church that would have been established by the local lord, and the village that was encouraged to develop. A fine example of a three-part Norman settlement. I've come here specifically to meet a man who has written a volume on each of the three castles, and here, finally, he believes it's possible to find serious Norman stonework that survived to this day. So Paul, how much of the fabric of this castle do you think is Norman?
Well, I think basically we've got this hall block here behind us. This is early. It fits the earthwork perfectly. It's built in the spine of the D, and we know that the stone it's built from came from the ditch. It's been geologically tested. therefore it's got to be built at the same time. So the thing itself, we can see, has got down it this battered plinth coming down here at an angle. And this is seen on lots of early Norman structures. We've also got pilastra buttresses all the way round. So it looks very early.
So what's the proof? How do we know William FitzOsborne was here?
Well, he made a lot of grants to his own abbey, Lear, in Normandy, and one of them was the Forest of Grosmont and the nearby church.
Oh, perfect.
And there we've got the original Latin about him granting the Forest of Grosmont.
Fantastic. So we know that this was his barony.
This was his
effectively.
domain.
His
yes.
domain, yeah.
Yes.
So do you think William FitzOsborne actually built and would have occupied this building?
I think quite likely he never even got here. I mean, he may have dashed up and down the border once or twice, but he was such a busy man. He was too busy running the country as regent for William I. He was fighting in York, he was fighting in Stafford, fighting at Chester. He was all over the place. And he was even ill in Normandy at one point. So I don't think he'd have actually got here until 1070, which would only have left him a few months here before he was killed. So I think it was all lieutenants doing the work.
And when do you think this hall then might have been completed?
My suspicion is it was built by 1135. It's purely for living in. It's show off, it's power. And it would have been beautiful with 11 windows on the ground floor, massive windows up above. It would have looked absolutely gorgeous, whitewashed. It would have dominated the entire district, and you'd have known somebody of substance was here.
So by 1135, the Norman barons were building great halls rather than great fortresses. Just 2 generations after the conquest, the Monnow Valley was not a warlike borderline. It was a settled Norman land. Back at White Castle, with its prominent position facing into Wales, the original intention may well have been to create an impregnable fortress at the edge of the Norman Empire. But within decades, the boundary line had moved west, through Wales, and even into Ireland, leaving the 3 castles to become the elaborate status symbols of a succession of medieval lords. To end my walk, I'm off to see a remarkable example of the Norman settlement of these borders. Once, this would have meant crossing from one barony to another. Today, it means arriving on English soil. Well, I'm leaving the public highway behind now because the owners of the Kent Church estate have granted me an audience. Sat between the Monnow River and the sizable end of my walk, Garway Hill, lies 5,000 acres that seems hidden from the modern world. At the heart is Kent Church Court, which has always been the home of the Scudamore family. Hello, Jan.
Dan, good morning to you. Welcome to Kent Church.
Thank you very much.
Very well.
What a beautiful view. Jan Lucas Scudamore is the current chatelaine of Kent Church Court. Her home dates back to the 14th century. Her deer park is almost certainly older than that. But having done some homework before this walk, I know that neither are as old as the family itself. So, on the internet, we have found, you couldn't make this up, we found an American called Warren Skidmore, and he claims to be part of your family, I suppose, and he's written a massive history from the Norman conquest onwards.
He's amazing. He came to stay here a few years ago, and I think he must be about 90, and I think keeping up with the Scudamores, their lineage, keeps him going, because he is the definitive chronicler of the Scudamores, and thank goodness we've got him.
But what's the Skidmore all about? Surely that's some sort of American adaptation.
No, Skidmore was the original pronunciation. And over the years, I suppose like all people, the way they formed their letters changed, and so Skidmore became Scudamore. But originally, when they came over from Normandy, they were called Escudamore, which I think loosely translated as the Shield of Love.
So you guys must have a whole chapter in this book.
We've got quite a few pages you can see here.
Burke's Landed Gentry. Ralph living 1086. This does seem to agree with Warren Skidmore.
And it's quite interesting that originally they started off as Walter, and in fact Ralph, who came here and worked at the castle at Lewis Harold for Edward the Confessor.
So hang on, so your first Scudamore we got actually arrived before the Norman invasion?
Yes.
Pages and pages of people who've been here ever since. How on earth did your family manage to survive in this place through civil war, upheaval of all kinds? How are they still here?
I think through judicious marriages. They married for land, they married for position. I think you could almost say they're a Teflon family because they always seem to be on the wrong side. If the parliamentarians were in, they were royalists. If they were Catholics, they were Protestants.
The Scudamore family and their land have survived a good deal better than most of the Norman evidence in this area. They are, quite remarkably, the living legacy of successful 11th century settlement by the Normans. And they owe their longevity to another Norman institution, that of primogeniture, a simple practice of passing titles and land to the eldest male heir. Perhaps that's one reason why so much of our history appears to start in 1066. Brilliant, you can see where I've come now. The Monnow Valley, Skenfrith just down there, and beyond it, the Bristol Channel. Getting dangerously close to the top here. It's got to be it. Oh, curses. Full summit. Would you believe it? Garway Hill is a hangover from medieval times. On one side, the private hunting forest of the Kentchurch estate, still full of deer and pheasant, whilst on top it remains common land, uncultivated yet free for grazing. My final hill could be unchanged in a millennium. Well, finally, no more false summits. I know I'm at the top now because there is the good old triangulation point. Whew. Extraordinary view from up here. See right across England and Wales. Apparently on a clear day you can see 7 counties. The Gloucestershire and the Cotswolds that way, right down towards Bristol over there. And then this way, of course, incredible barrier there of the Black Mountains, and beyond it, the Brecon Beacons. This was the challenging topography that Fitzosborne and his successors had to deal with. The Marcher Lords came here swift on the heels of their victory at Hastings. With no collective plan, and through turbulent generations of barons, they made a lasting impression on what had been a wild frontier land. I came here today to where England meets Wales, not just to look at how the Normans came to dominate these valleys here, but to show that the conquest is so much more than just an English story. What happened right here was a microcosm. After the Battle of Hastings, the Normans spread out in a chaotic, violent, unplanned way right through England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland. It was one of the greatest imperial expansions in the history of the British Isles. Join me next week when I'll be in Yorkshire, an area that suffered terribly at the hands of the Normans, but was ultimately left with one of their greatest legacies, the great abbeys of the north. Walking here through the grounds of York Minster, I'm in the shadow of the city's most famous landmark. And the earliest part of the building, the crypt, was built by the Normans. On my walk today, I'm going to be looking at how the Normans transformed York into the political and religious stronghold of the north of England. In the course of a fascinating century, they brought first terror and violence to this part of the country, and then long-term economic prosperity. And they left behind them a legacy that endured. If you mention the Normans to any true Yorkshiremen, they'll probably get an earful. They have a long memory in these parts, and what they're remembering in particular is the so-called infamous harrying of the north. In the late 1060s, there were a series of uprisings against Norman rule, and these were repressed by the Normans with terrible cruelty. Nearly every settlement between York and Durham was destroyed. The very fields were sowed with salt to destroy agriculture. 100,000 people were killed and tens of thousands more died of starvation. There were even reports of people resorting to cannibalism. The harrying brought the north under control in the most brutal and effective manner. And it meant the Normans had achieved what the Saxons never quite managed. From now on, Yorkshire and Northumberland would be part of a genuinely unified England, with the city of York as its regional capital. There's such an incredible layering of history here at York. It was the stronghold for the Romans in this part of the country and was very important under the Saxons, Vikings, and of course the Normans. And it went on really mattering. These extraordinary walls were built in the 14th century, and the Minster itself wasn't completed till 1472. The Great Walls and Minster are a sign of York's prosperity right across the Middle Ages. The city benefited from a boom started by the Normans. On this walk, I'm hoping to see how the invaders not only conquered and controlled this region, but inspired faith, commerce, education and technology, the fabric of a new era for the north. From York, I'm going to be travelling into rural parts devastated by the harrying of the north. Today it forms the southern edge of the North York Moors National Park. My 5-mile walk will take me from Helmsley to the village of Rievaulx, through an area reignited in the late Norman period, through the enthusiastic sponsorship of religion, in particular by the creation of one of our greatest abbeys. Today, the Yorkshire countryside is littered with romantic ruins of medieval monasteries. But before I head out there, I've come here to the edge of the medieval city of York to see where this link between York, the Normans and the monasteries really began. York Museum Gardens is where I've arranged to meet Professor Janet Burton, the country's foremost authority on the monasteries of northern England. The gardens lie beside the Roman origins of the city, the fort of Eboracum. But I've come here to see a very different sort of landmark, established by our country's next great builders in stone. 20 years after the massacre of the harrying, William II, son of the Conqueror, granted this site to the Benedictines and started St Mary's Abbey. So is it unusual to have such a big monastery so close to the middle of town?
No, it isn't really. In the 11th century, when St Mary's was founded, the late 11th century, it was really quite a normal thing to do to found a monastery, either within a city or on a site like this just outside the walls of the city.
How were they useful to the king? Why was it in his interest to have this vast abbey in the middle of York?
Primarily, it was the prayers of the monks. It were the spiritual services. The king looked on monks as spiritual soldiers. But Abbot Stephen himself, the founder abbot, wrote a short narrative of the foundation of St Mary's, and he makes the specific point that William II was quite aware that York had been a troublesome place. So when this stone abbey started to rise up here in the late 11th century, within sight of the stone minster, you think of the stone castles that William I had built, these were all real symbols of royal authority.
So what about the link between this abbey and perhaps the more famous abbeys to the north of here, where I'm heading next?
Many Norman lords, this new aristocracy that settled after the conquest, they start patronising St Mary's, they grant lands. So in one way, they're saying, you know, if this is the king's abbey, we want to show our support for the king by supporting his monastery. But then they go and do the same thing by founding their own monasteries. So they might build a castle, but they also found a monastery. They get the prayers of the monks, but they get a visible reminder of their power and their authority.
What about the effect of these monasteries on the population in these parts? Are these sort of little nuclei of Normanness that are slowly making the country more Norman?
I think they were, yes. I mean, William of Malmesbury, the Norman chronicler, comments on the coming of the Normans and how, I think he said, in every city and village you could see churches rise up in a style unknown before. I mean, they were building big. Sometimes we get mistaken impressions about monasteries such as St Mary's. They're thought of as being very inward-looking communities, little oases. But for all that, monasteries did interact with the societies, the communities in which they were located, through developing their estates, the production of manuscripts, through education. Often Benedictine abbeys ran schools, St Mary's ran one. Local people did comment on the importance, as they perceived it, of monastic houses as providers of education and hospitality, and the provision of charity.
St Mary's would play a role in York's development for 450 years. And in 1132, it played host to 12 monks, travelling from Clairvaux Abbey in northeast France. They represented a radical new group called the Cistercians, determined to live an austere, self-sufficient lifestyle in the true manner of St Benedict. They were travelling north, to the area of my walk today, destined to become the focus of a new community that would drive development in one of the remotest parts of the country. And they came at the invitation of the new Norman lord. The town of Helmsley, gateway to the vast expanse of the North York moors. Wild country, which would have been even more wild back in the 11th century. Following the harrying of the Normans, the productivity and the population would have fallen dramatically. But now the Normans were keen to change all this. In particular, a man called Walter Especk, who built Helmsley Castle. 50 years after the harrying, Walter Especk was a rising star. He was the justiciar of the north, effectively the king's chief minister. He held lands across Yorkshire and Northumberland and would go on to lead forces against the Scots at the Battle of the Standard. But from 1120 onwards, this was Especk's main residence. Walter Especk was responsible for the building of this east tower. Well, in fact, the bottom 2/3 of it. I love the way you can still see the original roof. It would have been a wonderful home for him and his family. And the chroniclers tell us that he had a large library of books as well. So this was a scholar, a military man, and very wealthy as well. It seems that the erudite Especk was a man of his time, and the late Norman period was the golden age for the foundation of monasteries. This was Especk's opportunity to seal his passage to heaven, enforce his political dominance, and leave a positive legacy for this troubled region. My real interest today lies out there on the moors, and that's where I'll be walking, because it was out there that Walter Especk gave huge tracts of his lands to that group of Cistercian monks that had been staying in St Mary's Abbey in York. And they would found the first ever Cistercian monastery in the north of England. And that's where I'm heading. With Helmsley Castle, Walter Especk had created an awe-inspiring symbol of his power and control. His next task was to establish a great institution to drive Norman colonisation. But as my walk leaves the town, Especk's impact was more subtle. He was guardian of the massive areas of royal forest, land which for the past 3 centuries has been the grounds of Duncombe Park. I'll be heading west, following the Rievaulx Valley upstream through Walter Especk's moorland estate and into the territory which he gifted the Cistercians. My destination is a small village, hidden at the bottom of Rievaulx and clustered around the ruins of Rievaulx Abbey, one of Yorkshire's great monastic institutions and a legacy that would far outlast the Normans. Back at Helmsley, my walk starts in a legacy of a very different kind, the back garden of Walter Especk's castle. For the past 3 centuries, this cleared area has served as the parkland of Duncombe Park, one of the great country estates of Yorkshire. Duncombe Park was set up by the Duncombe family in the very early 1700s. Now they had made all their money in banking. They were new money. So in that way they're an interesting parallel to Walter Speck, who of course in the 11th century was also a new face, a man on the make. It's said that the Norman lords created their own sporting venue right here, a clearing where moorland beasts were driven in and then hunted for the entertainment of guests watching from the castle. And to this day, you can still make out the faint ridge in the land that once enclosed the hunting area. Some of the Duncombe oaks today could be as old as this medieval arena. This is exactly the kind of pile Walter Speck would have built for himself if he'd been around in the 18th century. Since 1700, Duncombe Park has sought to celebrate and indulge in the beauty of the local landscape. The Cistercians too revelled in the solitude ensured by the Norman forests and the remote Rievaulx Valley. But the monks couldn't succeed without bringing a degree of civilization to the moors. Fantastic. This is my first view of this steep valley here called Rievaulx, and Rievaulx Abbey lies at the bottom of that, a few miles along here, and my walk's going to take me along the top of this escarpment. Beautiful views all the way, I hope. But the first thing I'm going to have a look at is actually the first piece of abbey infrastructure that's been left behind. It's called, on the map here, the medieval village of Griff, and this was all part of the abbey's lands. In 1131, Walter Speck agreed to give away 1,000 acres of his Yorkshire lands to the arriving Cistercians. This was but a small donation from the great Norman lord, but for the 12 pioneering monks, it was enough to establish their own abbey and remain true to their ideal of self-sufficiency. On the flat plateau above the Rye, I've come to the land of Griff Farm to meet the team who've investigated what took place here on the edge of Rievaulx's first grant. So guys, on my Ordnance Survey map, this is marked as a medieval village, is that true?
Yes and no. I mean, Domesday actually has reference to a ville, some sort of settlement on this location. We haven't produced any evidence of a settlement, have we really?
We spent about 6 weeks up here a few years back, really getting to grips with the earthworks, trying to understand what was going on.
Any surprises?
Once you look at the layout and start to understand how all the elements of this site relate to each other, you realise it's not a village, it's a single unit, it's a farmstead. I suppose the surprise being that we confirmed that it was a grange, not the deserted medieval village that we see mentioned on the maps. But certainly I think some of the more substantial buildings are a really, really good find.
So it's a big prosperous farm then, is that what it is?
That's exactly what it is, yes. It's a monastic farmstead, an outlying monastic farmstead called a grange. The building we're in is a barn, we think, from the plan of it and the size of it. And in Old French, grange means barn, so this is the barn at the heart of the grange.
How contemporary is this to the founding of Rievaulx Abbey?
It was there absolutely at the beginning of the foundation. It was part of the original grant from Walter Speck. There was the grant of the Abbey site, Grange land here. The initial grant was for about the equivalent of 1,000 acres. It wasn't a contiguous area of 1,000 acres. It would have been split between various parcels of land. The parcel of land that would have come with Griff as the bequest to the monastery at the outset would have been about 480 acres, about half the total land given over to the monastery.
This area is not a blank canvas when the Normans arrive. It's been used since prehistory. The name Griff, which is given to this grange, is a Norse name. In other words, we've got a Viking community living here who are farming a substantial area of land, arable land up here. So that's what the monastic community takes on, and they use that as a bridgehead for expanding out onto the North York moors there. I mean, we look at this today and it is a relatively tame arable landscape that looks as though it's been like that forever. But when the monastic community came here, first of all, they inherited something that was more akin to an island of arable in a sea of heather and moorland, really. Quite unpromising land, and it needed real vision and real entrepreneurial spirit, really, to actually make something productive out of that.
Okay, so are there any quarries around? The Griff was the first of what became a network of grange sites. As Rievaulx grew, it needed more food, more support work, and inevitably more income. By the 1300s, the abbey had 20 granges providing crops, fish, and vast numbers of sheep. They were the engine room of Rievaulx's economy, and as new benefactors continued to pledge land and resources, the reach of the abbey spread far beyond the moors. But from the very outset, the monks created a demand for wood, and here in Rievaulx, the steep valley sides have changed remarkably little. So how could this woodland here be productive?
Well, I mean, this is a piece of ground which really isn't much used for anything else, so it's making the best of a bad lot in a way, putting woodland on it. I say putting woodland on it, it's been wooded since the last ice age, but throughout the medieval period and right up to today, as you can see, it's been managed woodland, intensively managed, and for most of the medieval period and quite a lot of the post-medieval period as well, it's been coppiced. In other words, the trees have been cut right down to the base. You get that crop of fresh new growth, which after 20 years is perfect stuff for charcoal manufacture.
So I never know how you know that something's an ancient forest or not.
Well, not necessarily by the trees that are here today. I mean, we're surrounded by very modern larch and pine, but very often by the species that are at ground level, which rely on this injection of sunlight that they get through the process of coppicing. And this is a particularly good patch here. We've got these lovely little violets, bluebells, primroses. Just up there we've got wood sorrel, and over there wild garlic, wood anemones. So we've got the full range of species that really characterise what is the best of our woodland flora.
Whilst the demand for wood lasted centuries, the first decades of Rievaulx's life saw a demand for one special commodity: stone. And between 1132 and 1260, the abbey itself was built, rebuilt, and regularly extended. And right here, in what is still called Quarry Bank Wood, the scars of the building work are very clear indeed. You can see some of the blocks of stuff they haven't used.
Yes, it's almost left in situ as they stopped working. These were some of the rocks that were left behind that weren't needed.
Just a mile downstream from Rievaulx, the monks found a fine-grained limestone, which became part of the abbey's refectory. And we've seen a couple of others on the walk. I mean, were they quarrying all along this face here?
Yeah, this outcrop of limestone sort of comes along the edge of this escarpment, and indeed there are numerous other quarries along this area.
With a keen eye, you can spot Rievaulx's managed woodlands and quarries all along Rievaulx. In 1145, Walter Especk was pleased enough with progress to grant more lands further up the valley and into the moors. But my walk now heads downhill, into Rievaulx for the first time, and towards the quiet, hidden focal point of Rievaulx's world. It's my first proper view of Rievaulx Abbey. I always think those extraordinary buildings and this setting combine to make it one of the most evocative ruins in the whole of Europe. The grand site owes much to Rievaulx's third abbot, Aelred, a theologian of international repute. He presided over the abbey for 20 years at the very end of the Norman period. He was introduced to the area by none other than Walter Especk, and was so impressed that he never returned to his native Northumberland. By the end of the Norman age, Aelred had laid the framework for this site's development and had set Rievaulx up as the biggest hub for commerce and community in the region. It's an absolutely massive ruin, isn't it? I mean, was this the biggest abbey in the north of England?
Well, getting on that way, it was the headquarters of the Cistercians in the north of England, and was the first Cistercian abbey in the north of England. So its size warrants its status, shall we say, in that way.
And how many monks would there have been here?
Well, at its height there were 150 choir monks, so this is mid-13th century, and upwards of 450 to 500 lay brothers looking after them, so they were doing most of the manual work.
That's a big settlement, isn't it?
It is indeed.
So which parts are Norman?
Principally the nave that we're in now. If you turn round and look at the walls, you can see we've got two sets of Romanesque Norman arches, and then on top, where the stone changes colour, that architecture is more or less 100 years later.
Oh, so those rounded ones are Norman?
That's it, absolutely. That's the Norman part of the Abbey. And
that's a key piece of general knowledge.
Absolutely. The round ones are Norman. Once you start to get more pointed, you're into Gothic.
So, OK, so this bit either side of us is Norman as well?
So this is more or less Aelred's church. And then the rest of the architecture, going further, building higher and longer, is about 100 years later. You're about 1220, finished by about 1260.
So as the Abbey starts making more money, it starts to build extensions?
Absolutely, yes. You can build higher, nearer to God, and you can build longer because you can.
And so what are the monks up to during that golden age? I mean, some of them are in here studying and praying, others are out reclaiming land and farming and things like that.
Yes, I mean, because they were a self-sufficient community, the more land they got and the more the population grew here, of course they needed more supplies or whatever to keep that community going. But they were very quickly into trading in wool. Wool was the principal economic measure at that time, and they were foremost in certainly in this country, and formulating the Middle Ages, the wool industry in this country. The farming implements all had to be made. So they're very much into iron smelting. They were mining iron further up the valley, bringing it back here and smelting. So there were furnaces here during the monks' time and continued well after the dissolution.
So you think the legacy of the monks here actually continued well into modern history?
Absolutely. With the dissolution, the iron industry carried on for another 100 years. Because it was an important economic area, and it's as a result of the iron industry that we have the village now.
So what happens to the great founder, Walter Speck?
Well, it's interesting. The reason for the founding of the abbey was that he'd lost his son in a riding accident, and so declared that God would be the heir to his lands. He then ended up, in the last 10 years of his life, coming back here as a monk.
So he gave up all the power and prestige of being a Norman? Really?
Absolutely, yes. So he entered as a novice and was accepted into the orders and spent the last years of his life here within the abbey that he'd helped to found.
He must have been seriously worried about his soul.
Well, there's that about it, although giving the land, of course, makes sure you get through the pearly gates, that's for sure.
The remarkable actions of Walter Speck show just what kind of people the Norman elite were. Men of action and ambition. Perhaps his motive was no more than to gain his own entry into heaven. But the greatness of his institution is undeniable, and the ruins still dominate this valley. The simple Cistercian aims of solitude and self-sufficiency attracted so much support that they would end up controlling the wool and mining industries, building lines of communications across the moors and back to the trading hub of York. This sturdy Georgian bridge may be only just over a couple of 100 years old, but it's replacing a Norman bridge which have been doing exactly the same job, and that is connecting the abbey there with all sorts of things like granges and wool houses, quarries and ironworks further up the dale. The Normans imposed an infrastructure here of bridges, roads and drainage ditches which ensured that the moors would never be the same again. And the true extent of the Normans' legacy in the north only becomes clear when you look at the range of other institutions they founded. The monks of St Mary's were so impressed with the visiting Cistercians that some quickly left to establish their own Cistercian abbey at Fountains. This site and Rievaulx would become medieval giants, but would sit alongside Kirkstall and Roche, Kirkham and Byland, Whitby, Jervaux, Selby, and in the northwest, Furness and St Bees. In medieval England, only the king could match the monasteries for wealth and power, a fact that Henry VIII would find intolerable. But the dissolution of the monasteries couldn't change the fact that for 4 centuries, a nationwide network of Norman institutions had developed everything from faith to farming. And here in remote Yorkshire, the Norman abbeys are celebrated more than anywhere. Quarries, mining, woodland and ruins are all part of the fabric of a national park. And to end my walk, I've climbed up here to Rievaulx Terrace, which 150 years after the dissolution became part of Duncombe Park. Sir Charles Duncombe bought both the Helmsley estates and the Rievaulx estates for the sum of £90,000. The lands that Walter of Speke had divided in 1132 were back together once again. Oh, there we go. Lovely gap in the trees there. You can see Rievaulx Abbey, the grandest folly imaginable for the Duncombe family estate. I find it hard to believe that Walter of Speke, the powerful Norman baron who helped found this monastery, ended up swapping his castles and his lands to end his days as a monk down there. Seems hard to imagine with our 21st century sensibilities. In Yorkshire, we can see the Normans at their most barbaric, but, as illustrated by Walter of Speke, also at their most devout and forward-thinking. For me, Rievaulx really embodies all things Norman, the love of ambitious building projects and the obsession with power, wealth and Christianity. Walter of Speke died in 1154, which was coincidentally the same year as the last Norman king, Stephen. But by that time, this abbey and others like it were transforming this landscape totally. They were ushering in a new era of prosperity and international trade and commerce. And they were helping to cement this part of the country into the new Anglo-Norman kingdom.